For the final piece of this module, I want to go ahead and kind of put everything together. I want to take the jQuery autocomplete and connect it to our ASP.NET MVC Web API controller and get all of those pieces in place. Now, for this particular video, I went ahead and actually pre-coded all of this because there's a lot of pieces here and there's a lot of back and forth. And as I was recording it originally, I was like, okay, now you have to go here and do this, and now you have to go there and do this. And as someone probably watching the video, I would imagine that it just gets very cumbersome to figure out what direction I'm going and where I'm heading. So instead, I'm still going to do some of the jumping, but I'm not going to be doing the programming. It's going to be more of, and then here's where I found this piece of information, or, and this is what this line of code does, so that you can see what the finished product looks like and how I put the pieces together. And the goal here really is to get you an understanding of how did I get from point A, which was we have these disconnected pieces, to point B where everything fits together, and how did I put all that together in my head and in my code, because that's not actually, it's being done, but it's a lot of putting pieces together almost like Lego blocks. So I just want to make sure that you have a good understanding of how these all fit together, and you're just not sitting there watching me write code. So we're going to be utilizing the jQuery UI autocomplete widget. And what we started looking at last time was the remote data source. So if we scroll down here to the source piece, we said, okay, so here's the autocomplete setup. And inside of here, there's the source with the search.php, and we said we were writing something to replace search.php. So in our code, we created the product search controller, which is an API controller. And inside of here, we did things such as connecting the database, querying for matches, getting all of those pieces in place so that we could actually search for items with that particular code. Now, one thing to note with this, I did make one modification. By default, the autocomplete widget actually uses the keyword parameter of term. So this said query. In the last video, I changed it to term, so that way we know what we're actually searching for. So I just made that change here up in the input parameter from string of query to string term, and then made the changes in the code appropriately. So that was the first change I really made. Again, nothing significant, but it was just a matter of lining up the pieces. So now if we jump over to order items, I went ahead and just as a recap, we've got the text box here, which is called product search, and that is rendered out as our input box. So let me jump back here to our admin. So this is kind of just a recap of what we've done. So here's my user record. I'm going to click view orders. Here's my orders for my user. I'm going to click order details on this particular order. And then these are all the items that are on my order. And what we're working to do is be able to type into this box here. This is the product search box. And we've got a little placeholder here that says type product name to search. And that's all being done here with this placeholder setup. And we have the form class, or form control class, just to give it some aesthetics. So the real work is that we need to then wire up when we type into this text box, we actually call our search controller and get results back. So this is what it looks like. So if we type in grapes, we actually get back grapes. We type in cheese, we get back cheese. And this is all happening via those calls to our controller, our API controller. And there's orange as well. If we type something like radish, we don't get anything back because we don't have a radish product in our database. So that's the idea. So how do we make that work? Well, if you start by looking at the autocomplete, you'll see here that we have a remote data source. So we need to change this remote data source and point it to our Web API MVC. The second piece of this is going to be a select action. So when someone clicks on that item, what happens in our code? So this is the select event. The third piece is the aesthetics and how that's laid out on the screen. And for me, I ended up actually digging through some of these, and I found that the custom data and display was the closest piece of code that I was looking for. And as we scroll down through here, you'll see here that they've got this autocomplete instance dot render item with a function, And then inside of here, they're basically building out some markup. I'm not going into too much detail around the jQuery piece. There is a prereq for this course to taking the web design, where I know they cover JavaScript and I believe they cover jQuery. If you're not too familiar with the content of jQuery, I would recommend going and looking at some of the jQuery documentation. It's a little beyond the scope of this course, but I at least want you to have an understanding of it, so I'll link that into the course as well. But basically what this is doing is it's creating an LI, or a list item element, and then appending to it an A tag with the item label. So whatever their data source is, it returns a label and it returns a description. So they're putting a BR in between to kind of break up the lines, and then they close their A tag. And they're appending it to a UL element, or a unordered list. So that's happening on the creation of their item, or when they render their items into their result list. So I copied this code as well and then modified it for my particular needs. So that's the idea of what we did. So I basically took this concept and I transplanted it into our application. So if we scroll down here, I created that section scripts. I have my jQuery UI script being rendered into this page, and then I created a script block of my own, and that's where I basically implemented my version of the autocomplete. So we have this is the starter function for all jQuery. So this basically is the equivalent of saying, when the page loads, run everything between this curly bracket and this curly bracket. So this entire body gets run after the script, or after the page load completes. Extra semicolons. So what we do here is, the first thing was we do an item selector. So we're selecting the product search box, text box, that's identified up here. Now this is a convention that I just know about, but basically I did #, which is the ID selector token, and then product search. And I know that the ID of my text box is going to be product search by convention, because I ended up naming this box product search, and therefore when ASP.NET MVC creates a text box, it will use this name as the string name, or it will utilize the property when we use text box 4. It's not always perfect, but generally speaking, that's what happens. So sometimes you may have to render out the page in the browser, run your app, render it out in the browser, and look at what the name or ID of your control is that you're wanting to manipulate, to make sure that it's coming out to be what you want. Often if you end up putting it inside of a loop, then it'll end up being different. It won't end up just being the name of the property, because there's a collection of them. So you'll end up with that indexer, square brackets with the I. So you'll have to kind of work around that and maybe utilize something like a class to select those items instead of selecting them by ID. So we select the text box, and then we call the autocomplete function. This is coming from the jQuery library. And then inside of it, we have to pass particular parameters. Source, the source of where the data is coming from. In our case, it's calling out to our API. The minimum length needed in the text box to initiate the search. What happens when an item is selected from the results box. And then down here I have that autocomplete render item, where I identify how the item should be rendered in the results box. So let's kind of just go through this a piece at a time. So you have to keep in mind that this is actually all JavaScript code, and the only place where you see any C# is where I have the @ symbol, and that's part of the razor syntax. So I'm basically jumping from JavaScript into C# temporarily at the server and saying, when I'm on the server, render out this C# code and then put it into my JavaScript, which gets then run on the browser or the client side. So the JavaScript all runs on the client side, the razor or C# code runs on the server side prior to sending the page to the client or to the browser. So you have to kind of keep those concepts in mind. Again, the razor code, or the stuff that starts with an @ symbol, is server code. So that code gets run on the server before the page gets sent to the browser. Once it's at the browser, the only code that the browser can run is JavaScript. So everything else here really is JavaScript code to be run on the browser itself. So my source has to ultimately be a string or a URL that the JavaScript and the browser can run. So what I'm doing is I'm saying my source is a string. That string is going to be set up on the server side. So I'm using my @ symbol, and then I'm calling the URL.content C# code and saying point me to, and this tilde represents the root of my website. API/product search, which is how I get to my product search web API. So that's where I'm sending the data to. My minimum length is 1, so 1 character typed in the box will execute a search. Then this third thing I'm saying is when I select an item, I want to run this function, which it goes from here to here, and have it perform a particular action, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Then once I've set up the autocomplete, I then make a secondary call, and these are chained together. So basically think of this as an object, and then I'm saying dot autocomplete, so I'm chaining that together, and I'm saying take the instance, and then I want to modify the render item function, and then I'm writing another function which goes from here to here. That's basically going through, creating that li element, creating an a tag inside of it. I'm grabbing the name for my API, and I'm grabbing the unit price for my API. So these two, if I kind of do a side-by-side here real fast. So here is the product search view model, and inside of product search view model I have a name and I have a unit price. So this name correlates to this name for my C# code. This unit price correlates to this unit price for my C# code. When I call API/product search and I perform my search, the value that comes back is going to be some JSON data. And that JSON data is going to be in the format of having a name, a unit price, a description, and an ID. All of those properties will come back in our JSON data, just like we saw in the last video with our XML. So we've got those pieces in place now, and this will allow things to render back into our page and give us our autocomplete, which we saw. So again, if I type in something like grapes, I get back grapes. I can even just type a single G and it'll do the search. If I type ORA, I get orange, A for apple, and C for cheese. So that's giving me back all of my elements. So now the question is, that's great. So now we can see the items, we can do that kind of work, but then I want to be able to do something like search for orange, and then I want to be able to click on this orange, and then I want this quantity to go from 2 to 3. So how do we make that part of the process work? Well, that's where the select comes into play. So this select says when I click on an element or I select it, what happens? So what I'm doing is I say when I select an element, I want it to go to the UI element that was selected, grab the item, which is basically that JSON data or that JSON object, and then I want to get the ID from there. That ID is my product ID. So I'm going to store that in a variable. And then what I chose to do in this case is I'm doing a redirect, which is the same as clicking on a link, and I'm redirecting to a URL action. So this is again C# code because I've got that @ symbol. So I want to redirect to an action called add item to order. And in that action, I want to pass the order ID and I want to pass the product ID. Now I have a mix of Razor and JavaScript code going on here, so let me kind of break it down. So @ symbol all the way up to this yellow parenthesis is all C# Razor code. And what's happening is I'm calling url.action so that I can get a URL that points to the add item to order action, which is inside of my manage orders controller. And then that manage orders controller action, which let me actually jump to that code so you can see it, takes in 2 parameters. It takes an order ID and a product ID. So what I'm saying here is I need to grab the order ID out of my model. So my model is a list or an enumerable of order item view models, and each one of those order item view models has an ID as part of it, an order ID. So I'm grabbing the first one, and then I'm grabbing the order ID out of that, and then that becomes part of a string, and then the second piece is I'm then appending to my get product ID, and then I'm passing the product ID that comes from my JavaScript. So this whole line here is C# code that gets spit out onto the page, and then the second part is dynamic and it happens when I select the product. So we'll jump into the HTML in a moment and look at what that looks like, but there's part of this that's happening on the server side ahead of time so that I know where the action is and where the controller is to redirect to. And then I know what order ID I need because it's based on the order that I'm loading onto the screen. Then the second piece of it is I need to grab the product ID of the product that was selected. And I need to append that at runtime, so to speak. So if we jump back into our code and let's jump into, let's just view page source. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom here past all of my products, and we'll find our JavaScript. So what's happening here is here's that mix of Razor and JavaScript. So the part that gets rendered out at the server is this /admin/manage orders /add items to order question mark order ID equals 1. So that's the order ID for this order. And then I'm appending to it at product ID equals, and then there's the product ID variable that will actually get set when I select the item. So that piece is all happening at runtime. And then here's additionally the other Razor code that gets rendered that points to /API/product search. So this is all JavaScript now that gets run and interpreted by our browser. This is not server code, this is not C#, this is JavaScript code here. Alright, so let's jump into the C# side of things, and under our manage order controller, add item to order, and let's just kind of walk through what's happening. So the first thing I do is I verify my input parameters. I make sure that I have an order ID and a product ID. If either one of these is less than or equal to 0 or undefined, then I just simply return a HTTP not found with invalid input parameters. I don't specify which parameter is missing because this indirectly could be used by someone to do some sort of hack, and that's not my intention. So I don't want to give them information that could be used for a hack. I want to try to keep it as minimum as possible. So that's the goal here with this, is to kind of just say something's wrong, but I'm not going to tell you specifically what it is. So then this is where I connect into my database. So the first thing I do is I get the product in order. I want to verify that I'm actually getting a product in an order. If either one of these comes back as null or undefined, then I don't have the right input parameters to perform the action. So again, I throw in invalid input parameters, HTTP not found. So then the next step is to check if an existing item is an existing order item with that product exists, and if so, then I just need to add one, so up the quantity by 1. So I grab for the order item ID, and I'm using the first or default, and I'm searching off of the order items, and I'm saying where there's a product ID that equals the input parameter product ID. So if I come back with an DTO for order item, so if it's not equal null, then I up the quantity by 1, and then I update the modified date. Else, if I'm adding a new item because it doesn't exist for that product, then I create a new order item, set all the properties, add it to the context, and save changes on the context. So either way, whether I'm updating or adding, I'm doing this step, and then I'm just calling save changes here after this if statement block. Because either way, I've got to save changes. So then the last step is I redirect back to order items, passing the order ID back in, and it basically refreshes the page after I select the new item. So let's go ahead. I'm actually going to jump back a screen because that item or that order has a whole bunch of different items on it, and I'm going to jump into this order, which I believe only has 2 items. Alright, so let's go ahead and start by adding an apple. So we'll click on apple, and that refresh the page very quickly. So now the quantity is 2, orange is 1, apple is 2. So if I do apple again and click, now it's 3, and you'll see that the date modified is updated. If I do orange and click, now orange is 2. If I do cheese and click, cheese gets added to the order as 1 item. I can now do cheese again and then add it a second time. So this is working very well, and it's giving me the experience I want the user to have. Where they can select or search for an item and add it. So as an admin, it's very quick and easy for me to say, oh, you need to add grapes to your order. I search for grapes, I click it, and then it's added to the order immediately. So that's the overall experience that you want to give your users when you're dealing with something that's using the AJAX or asynchronous JavaScript type of functionality and feel, is you want to make it feel like it's running in real time. And there's additional things we could have done to do dynamic calls to the back end and update the table dynamically on the front end without doing that page reload. But for something as simplistic as this, that refresh doesn't really take any time or any work, and we get a similar experience. So hopefully that was a good dive into Web API and a little bit of jQuery and understanding how all those pieces work. This code is available up on GitHub, so feel free to jump in and take a look at the source and figure out how all of this works. It'll be very helpful to you as you're learning how to set up these pieces within your own project.